Last year, a new piece of legislation began its passage through Parliament, the Equality Bill. Britain's equality laws have built up piecemeal over 40 years. So the government decided to bring them together into one single Act of Parliament. It seemed like a sensible step, but when the bill came before the House of Lords in January of this year, it rang alarm bells. Some Christians were anxious that in practice it amounted to the most serious assault on religious liberties in centuries. Some believed that it undermined the Church's right to decide on doctrine. The Catholic Church, for example. Many thought it would make it illegal to appoint male-only clerics, opening the way for female priests. You see, historically, churches have had the right to refuse to employ anyone on the grounds of gender, marital status or sexual orientation. They feared that the new bill would change all of this. For its part, the government insisted that it never intended to apply the new law to ministers of religion. They would remain exempt. Even so, some bishops in the Church of England used their inbuilt advantage as members of the House of Lords to speak out against the bill.
They are not matters for the law to impose. Start down that road and you put law and conscience into inevitable collision. And that way actually indeed lies ruin.
For many in the Church, the bishop's intervention was long overdue. I've come to the Daily Telegraph to meet a leading religious opinion former. Anglican priest George Pitcher is the religion editor for the paper. He believes the bishop's move was popular because it upheld the wider principle of a religion's right to decide on its own rules.
I'm pleased that they were there to defend our established Church of England and its practices in the House of Lords, because I think that's, if you like, a part of our rich, unwritten constitution. I'm glad that they were intervening in the debate to say what they had to say. I'm wholly in favour of women being priests, and if women are priests, of course they should be bishops. I'm entirely in favour of homosexuals being open about their sexuality and so on. But, I think once you start saying that you're not allowed to think that these people are leading sinful lives or are wrong in any way, then we lose that healthy sense of debate. And I think that's prescriptive. Yes. I think that's dangerous.
Is this why so many came in against the legislation? I mean, the bishops?
Well, funnily enough, I think that the threat that is most often cited actually is missing the point. I think that too many Christians are saying we should have the right to discriminate against who we believe should be outside the church. But I think the danger really is in the prescriptive nature of an Equality Act, such as it's constructed, which seeks, if you like, to prescribe how people think and what is right think and what is wrong think. It's quite Orwellian.
A thought crime.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
George Pitcher's views were echoed by others in the Anglican Church. Then, at the beginning of February, the Catholic Church also stepped into the row.
Pope Benedict has criticised the Equality Bill currently going through Parliament.
The Pope took the highly unusual step of speaking out. He said some of Britain's equality legislation imposed unjust limitations on the freedom of religious communities.
Simply put, the Pope was saying that guaranteeing freedom from discrimination for groups such as gay people is being bought at the expense of his own church's freedom of belief.
His intervention upset many secular voices who argue that any debate on the issue of equality has to be conducted on the basis of reason and reason alone. Ziauddin Sadar is a respected Muslim scholar, a prolific author and columnist for the New Statesman. He's also a former commissioner of the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
in contemporary times, you can't argue from authority or on the basis of dogma. For public space to be productive, the arguments have to be based on reason and rationality. And I think the problem is, for example, the contemporary intervention of the Pope is more or less based on dogma rather than analyzing.
What should the Pope have said recently? I mean, he said that this equality legislation was against natural law, which I suppose you would argue is a dogmatic thing to say.
Yeah.
How should he have framed his argument?
Christians, like all people of faith, have to realize that the world changes. Morality is not a static thing. Morality is something that evolves. It's something that we arrive at sometimes by contestation.
Even if it would involve women priests ultimately, or transgendered people working in mosques, that's okay?
Yeah. I mean, either you believe in it. I mean, the thing is that it is not simply enough to say, I believe in equality. You need to delineate what equality means in contemporary times. And equality doesn't have the same meaning for all time, you know.
What if it's against the doctrine as laid down in your holy book?
Well, it has to be reinterpreted.
Easier said than done.
Absolutely, easier said than done. But the thing about Scripture is that nothing in Scripture is kind of defined for eternity. Everything in Scripture has to be negotiated and interpreted. And when you engage with the Scripture, then you bring yourself to it, and you bring your own time, the values and concerns of your time.
And you're including the Quran when you talk about the Scriptures.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. But the Catholic Church in Britain welcomed the Pope's intervention. Its recently appointed head, Archbishop Vincent Nichols, says the Pope was warning of a bigger threat. Equality legislation is part of a secular ideology, and it can't be allowed to ride roughshod over religion.
One way in which to understand the tensions around equality legislation is not to think that one is a matter of doctrine and the other isn't. You know, secularism is a doctrine, and it can be as forceful and it can be as narrow-minded as the worst of a doctrinaire Christian position. So I think it is a question of really opening up a much more constructive dialogue. And I think the threat that he sees is much more a threat to the quality of the life of Europe. So I think he's much more interested in saying the human good, the good of society, will be damaged if this, as it were, source, this rich vein of generosity and goodness is switched off and is sent underground, is sent out of the public sphere.
It's no surprise that the Catholic and Anglican churches were ready to fight for religious freedom. They're trying to defend rights and privileges they've had across Europe for centuries. But perhaps what is surprising is that a growing number of non-Christian voices seem to share the Pope's anxieties. They too believe that equality laws are putting the fundamental liberal principle of tolerance under strain. In fact, Britain's chief rabbi goes further. He argues that limiting religious freedoms goes against the spirit of the first human right, won over 300 years ago.
Rights are a good thing. And they arose really in England in the 17th century after a century of religious warfare throughout Europe, when, to put it bluntly, Protestants and Catholics were killing one another. So the major question was, how can people of strongly conflicting religious beliefs live peaceably together? People stopped saying religious faith is supremely important, therefore everyone should have my religious faith, to saying religious faith is supremely important and therefore everyone should have the right to the faith that they in conscience believe. And with that one simple move, religion turned into a friend of liberty instead of being its enemy. That's why it becomes ironic when rights themselves become a threat to religious liberty.
What religious voices are saying is that whilst equality legislation confers all manner of new rights and freedoms, it's also undermining religious freedom. And it now seems a good number of us share that worry. We commissioned a special poll to find out if people think Britain is becoming more or less tolerant of religion. Our poll revealed that people are divided about whether we really are more tolerant or not. Indeed, of the 1,000 people polled, the biggest group, 44%, actually thought Britain is becoming less tolerant. It's a paradox. The boom in individual rights and freedoms is not matched by a corresponding sense of a rise in tolerance. Ironically, one reason may be an unintended effect of the equality laws. Human rights legislation can create a raft of potentially competing freedoms.
Going green isn't just about making energy savings. It carries the same weight as a religion.
An artist should be free to practice their art. And if the artist wants to rip up a book, it doesn't matter what book it is. When it wasn't so long ago, the Nazis were burning Bibles and defacing them, ripping the pages out.
The Hindus and Sikhs are preparing for Diwali, but people who work won't automatically get time off to celebrate.
It's a recipe for conflict. Away from the law courts, it's raising deep questions about our commitment to liberty. Roger Trigg, a philosopher at Oxford University, worries that nowadays almost any right will trump the right to Christian belief. He points to the recent case of the Christian registrar at Islington Council, who got into trouble for asking not to carry out same-sex civil partnerships.
Principle was they were against discrimination, but they were against discrimination of people on grounds of their sexual orientation. They weren't, it seems, very concerned about discrimination on grounds of religion, and yet that is just as crucial. It seemed to me in that case there was a balance between two different things there, but they didn't see it that way. They just only saw discrimination on one side.
Churches, for instance.
Now, there is a kind of view amongst some people that would say, if you don't like it, you're free to give up your profession. You must do as you're told. And I think that kind of overriding of deep feelings of conscience is very dangerous. Indeed, I think democracy depends on these deep feelings of conscience. If people actually in a democracy aren't acting in accordance basically with what they believe to be right, it all just becomes a power struggle, different interests against each other, no idea that anybody's acting for the common good, and that will destroy us.
Christians point to other examples.